On the 22nd of March 2021, the British government unveiled their plans to upgrade 148 of their Challenger 2 main battle tanks and designate them Challenger 3. Challenger 3 has a host of improvements over its predecessor, but perhaps the most significant, or at least the most discussed, is the decision to replace the 120mm rifled gun seen on Challenger 2 with a 120mm smoothbore. For anyone with any knowledge of firearms, this seems an odd decision. Almost every firearm made in the last 200 years has used a rifled barrel. That's even where the term rifle comes from. But what if I told you that the vast majority of modern tanks already use smoothbore guns? In fact, Challenger 2 was one of only a handful of vehicles still using a rifled barrel. So what's the difference? What's wrong with rifled barrels? What's so great about smoothbores? And why are tanks using technology that was considered obsolete by the late 1800s? When tanks first rose to prominence in the First and Second World Wars, all of them used rifled guns. This means that there were spiral grooves cut into the inside surface of the barrel. When the projectile is fired from the gun, it engages with these grooves as it passes down the barrel, which imparts a spin. This is known as spin stabilization, as the rotation of the round means it's much less likely to tumble or veer off course. Firing the same round from a smoothbore gun, you would notice a significant drop in accuracy, as the non-spinning round would be much more susceptible to tumbling and twisting during its flight. So for any sort of solid round, rifle guns were just superior. The huge increase in accuracy meant that you'd be a fool to try and use a smoothbore cannon. In 1961 though, the Soviets revealed their new tank, the T-62, armed with a 115mm smoothbore gun. Clearly something had changed, and it all comes down to ammunition. A few years earlier, all vehicles were using some form of AP, or Armour Piercing ammunition. This is basically just a big bullet. Fire it at someone and it will rip through the armour and cause a lot of damage inside, especially if it has a high explosive filler in the case of APHE. And this worked fine for a while. But by the end of the war, armour had improved significantly, and the calibre of gun needed to punch an AP shell through, say, a Tiger II or an IS-3 was massive. So this was solved in two ways. The first method was something called APDS ammunition, or Armour Piercing Discarding Sabot. The way this worked was to use a small, narrow penetrator made of a dense metal like tungsten. The smaller projectile means more speed, which means more penetration. But it was narrower than the tank barrel it was being fired from, so it needed another component, the sabot. The sabot would surround the penetrator, forming a seal with the barrel and the rifling. Then, when the round left the end of the barrel, the sabot would fall away, or discard, allowing the penetrator to fly towards its target at insane speeds. The other method was to use heat shells, high explosive anti-tank. These rounds are fired like regular AP shells, but when they hit their target they detonate, with the shaped charge inside forming the explosion into a very narrow, hypersonic jet, capable of piercing huge amounts of armour at any range. This type of warhead was used on the bazooka and Panzerfaust weapons, and became the go-to method of defeating armour in the years following World War II. But rifled guns actually limited the effectiveness of both of these ammunition types. In the case of sabot rounds like APDS, the longer and thinner the penetrator was, the more penetration it had, but it also required a much faster spin to stay stable. And as you approached a length to width ratio of around 6 or 7, the rate of spin required to stabilise these dart-like rounds was just too fast to be realistic. Heat rounds actually had the opposite issue. They were spinning too fast. The effectiveness of the penetrating jet was diminished by the forces imparted on the jet by the spin. See, the shaped charge was trying to focus the explosion to one small point, while the spinning forces were trying to spread it out. And for a while, this was just sort of accepted. The penetration of NATO guns was still more than enough to engage Soviet MBTs of that time. But from a Soviet perspective, their current rifled guns would struggle against vehicles like the M60 or the Centurion, and a radical change was needed. To defeat these vehicles, the Soviet would use a new type of ammunition: Armour Piercing, Fin-Stabilised, discarding Sabot. These rounds worked very similarly to APDS, except that they had fins on the rear of the penetrator. This small addition meant that they could have extremely high length to width ratios, and that the spin rate didn't need to be as fast, as they were fin stabilised rather than spin stabilised. In fact, any sort of spin would actually be a detriment to these rounds, as the fins would act like a sort of paddle as it flew, greatly decreasing velocity and thus penetration. But the Soviets' APFSDS rounds on the new T-62 didn't have spin, remember. It was a smoothbore gun. Smoothbore has historically had one advantage over rifled: the round leaves the barrel at a greater velocity. Rifling does have a huge increase in accuracy, but some of the kinetic energy of the round is used to spin it, so the shell does actually fly slightly slower. Considering that APFSDS rounds already have very good accuracy thanks to the fins, this boost to muzzle velocity, and therefore penetration, made the Soviet smoothbore guns incredibly scary. The years following the introduction of the T-62 would see widespread adoption of composite armour, necessitating the use of APFSDS worldwide. The Leopard 2 would be the first Western tank to mount a smoothbore main gun in 1979, and the vast majority of NATO countries would follow suit, firing heat and APFSDS rounds to defeat enemy armoured threats. Now, you may be wondering why it's taken until 2021 for the UK to adopt this seemingly superior technology. And the answer? HESH. HESH, or High Explosive Squash Heads, were a British invention in World War II, and they grew very fond of them. These rounds work by slinging a large amount of high explosives at the target, squashing it against the side, and then detonating it. This doesn't actually penetrate the armour like most other shells try to, but the explosion flings a shockwave through the plate. As this shockwave exits the armour on the other side, it takes with it small chunks of metal, known as spall. These chunks of spall will fly around the interior of the vehicle, hitting critical components such as ammunition, fuel, or even the poor crew inside. The thing with HESH is that it performs better if it's spinning, as the spin will spread the explosive out over a larger surface area, which in turn will produce more spall and thus cause more damage. And the Brits liked HESH. It works against tanks, of course, but you could fire it at just about anything. It has great performance against fortified positions, and I'm sure I don't need to explain what a round like that will do against lightly armoured vehicles or infantry. However, HESH works best on big plates of steel. The widespread use of ceramic composite armour may have diminished its ability to create spall. And to add to this, the introduction of spall liners, Kevlar layers designed to catch spall fragments, meant that HESH just didn't have the performance that it used to. Other nations had committed to using their tanks mainly as anti-tank weapons, hence the focus on anti-armour performance and the adoption of APFSDS. Britain still liked to think that its main battle tanks would also be able to support infantry, and rifled guns are still a lot better in that regard as they can use HE and HESH, so that may explain why it took them so long to make the big switch. A switch which may have been, in the end, more about standardisation with our allies in NATO than purely performance-based. So, to recap, rifled guns are great if you're using rounds that perform well when spin stabilised. AP, APDS, HE, HESH. Smoothbore guns are great if you're using rounds that perform well when fin stabilised. APFSDS, Heat FS. Both types have their own advantages and disadvantages, but in the modern world, especially regarding tank-on-tank warfare, it seems that smoothbore guns are the current king, and Challenger 3 is looking to be an incredibly capable platform. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this one, please do leave a like and remember to hit that subscribe button and the little bell icon to get notified when I release a new video. I'll see you in the next one.